Okay, thank you. Right, so this handout is clearly too long to go through in half an hour, I'm sorry, but I will try and skip just to the good bits, or the relevant bits, and still tell a coherent story. So my main question is what the relation is between phases and islands, if any. And of course, this is a relation that's often discussed, often talked about. It's often kind of assumed that islands and phases will coincide in some way. But there's quite a big problem, which I just want to point out, especially if we have Chomsky's most recent idea about edge features. So really, the relation between phases and islands is more asserted than proven. And it's often said that phases will yield a strong form of subjacency, as Chomsky's put it, but really that's wishful thinking, because phases are designed precisely to be escapable, right? They have edges, you can get out of them, and islands are things you can't get out of. So already there's this antagonism there. But the antagonism is worsened once we bring these undeletable edge features into the picture. So there's a couple of quotes there under one, which says that the property of unbounded merge relates to the statement that lexical items have edge features. And then Chomsky discusses the question of whether these edge features should be deletable or not. And he concludes that they have to be undeletable, because if they were deletable, you'd only ever get head complement sequences. As soon as you've merged something with a lexical item, the edge feature would be deleted, and that would be it. You couldn't have any specifiers at all. And if you can't have any specifiers, then you can have movement. And so Chomsky says, let's conclude then that the edge feature is undeletable, and then you can have as many specifiers as you like. If you, though, can have as many specifiers as you like, then it's going to be very hard to block a derivation like in 2 of a subjacency effect, because there's nothing now to stop you from projecting an extra, or however many you want, specifier of CP, and thus moving out of the CP, even if you've already got one specifier. Taken up by who, you can still move what across it, because you have undeletable edge features. Of course, people come up with all kinds of ways of trying to limit CP to a single specifier, but what I'm saying is if we take undeletable edge features on face value, that's not really an option. You can have as many specifiers as you like. So what we need is a theory of when the edge feature is usable and when it isn't, if we want to have a theory of islands. So when is the edge available, when isn't it? There are 3 possible ways of perhaps approaching this problem in terms of edge features. We could have a theory of when you can add edge features, when they're accessible, but the possibility that I want to explore today is just playing with this idea of the deletability of edge features. Chomsky's actually, originally at least, he was rather more tentative about whether edge features should be deletable or not. So I want to suggest that in some cases, for principled reasons hopefully, it may be the case that a lexical item, a phase head, has a deletable edge feature, and then it won't have an edge, at least not always, perhaps. When it comes to addressing how islands come about, Chomsky often says things like, well, perhaps it's to do with the wrong search. A probe goes the wrong way in a derivation, it's the wrong choice of search path. I don't think these kinds of options are really valid, because what does this mean to search into a phase that's already been passed, or to go too deep? What does this mean other than the PIC? The PIC is really the only source of opacity that we should have in the system, I think. And the PIC is a subtractive view of locality as given in 4. There's no such thing as the wrong choice of search path, because anything that's not been transferred is fair game for probing. Anything that's been left behind, anything that's still in the derivation that's not been transferred, isn't a wrong path. It's there, so it should be probable. So just to summarize the problems that we have if we want to equate somehow phases with islands at the bottom of page 2, there's no reason why we shouldn't have endlessly available edges, which undermines an account of MLC effects like super-raising and WH islands. And there's no reason, given this idea that the PIC is simply a subtractive view of locality, that the edge of a phase, say spec of little VP, should not be completely internally accessible. And that undermines several accounts of left branch opacity, because there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to see into the left branch of, say, the VP, into the spec VP, inside the subject in spec VP. Okay, I will now skip a couple of sections in order to get to what I want to propose. But the idea is, because we can't really use phases, because we can't use the PIC to give us islands, even those analyses which talk about phases and islands still rely on additional statements in order to actually get the opacity effects, the island effects that they're talking about. It's not the PIC itself that ever does the work. It's usually some kind of freezing statement like in 10 or in 14, which says that particular positions are frozen. You just can't see inside them as a basic property of that position. So syntactic objects in phase edges are internally frozen, as in 10, or spec TP is a phrasing position. Often this is said to be due to spec TP and such being the head of an A chain. So it's due to inactivity in some sense. Once you've deactivated the head of an A chain, then not only does that head of the chain become invisible, but everything inside, everything contained inside, everything inside the DP. So if you deactivate the head of a DP, the D, then everything inside the DP is also somehow becomes inaccessible as well. Well, that's obviously the effect we want. That's the observation. But the fact is intervention the best way to look at it? It's a kind of defective intervention. In fact, it's a kind of super defective intervention, because if you, okay, so you valued the D head and it's no longer phi active, but now it seems to block all probes across, even WH probes. So, and this kind of idea that you have a generalized intervener, of course, is something that Klaus Halbos has said. That is what a phase head is. I want to see whether we can get these effects purely from the PIC without having to come up with special kinds of extended intervention or super defective intervention, all these kinds of things. So most approaches that talk about phases and islands end up really attributing the opacity effects to prematurely terminated search, intervention, and the like. But I want to see if we can actually treat it as a PIC effect properly. So the PIC spells stuff out, and then you just can't see it anymore. Can we just stick purely to that idea and still get an account of islands? So with that in mind, just one thing to say at the bottom of page 6, the idea of phases that I'm going to be adopting is what I take to be kind of the minimal view, which is that phase heads are the locus of agreement features or probes, uninterpretable features, unvalued features, and when those features are valued, that's what triggers spell out immediate transfer, and thus you get phases that way. So uninterpretable features are things that we need to get rid of, and transfer is a way of getting rid of them. The two coincide. So that's the view of phases and transfer that I'm adopting here. So phases are the locus of unvalued features. Right. So I'm going to now play with this idea that perhaps not all heads have undeletable edge features, and some may have deletable ones, and see where that takes us. It's not going to be a complete story, but it'll be a start, hopefully. So in the original manuscript of Approaching UG from Below, Chomsky only tentatively assumes that the edge feature is undeletable, as you can see highlighted in the quote in 17. So I want to exploit that tentativity and say perhaps some heads, for principled reasons, have to have undeletable edge features, but other ones can just have deletable ones. So the question is, which ones would have to have undeletable ones? The idea, skipping across to page 8, is that if we think about how valuation works and how agree works, then it's clear that certain phase heads are going to have undeletable edge features, because if they didn't, they would always induce a crashing of the derivation. So from good design, they have to have undeletable edge features. And the reason for this is if we assume that valuation requires complete match, as in 20, so this is the idea from Chomsky 2001, that in order for agree to take place, in order for a phi probe to value case on a goal, it has to be phi complete. It has to have the full set of phi features. That means if the head is defective, if it's, say, lacking person, if it only has a number probe, like passive accusative little v is often assumed to be defective in that way, then it can't value case on the DP inside its domain. That DP therefore remains active. It has to be valued by a higher probe. And if those defective little v's are phases, as I assume they are, like Marantz and Legat and others, all these things are phases, not just the transitive little v, then you're going to have have an undeletable edge feature on defective phases, so that all the things that they can't value, because they are defective, can get out of the phase. So it follows from good design that defective heads which don't have a full complement of phi features, they're going to have undeletable edge features. But all the others can have deletable edge features, in principle. So anything that's not a phase head has a deletable edge feature. In the case of non-defective phase heads, they too can have a deletable edge feature, but I'm also going to assume that you can associate, that the edge feature actually remains active until the probe with which it's associated is valued. So the edge feature is deletable, but it only gets deleted as part of the probe with which it's associated, and when you delete that probe, then you delete the edge feature as well. This gives you the difference between obligatory EPP and optional EPP in 19, which I'm not going to go into today. But just summarizing in 22 on page 9, if you have a phase head with a complete probe, then that's deletable, or at least it's deletable once the probe is valued. If you have a defective phase head, then it's an undeletable edge feature, and if you have a non-phase head, then it's a deletable edge feature. That's pretty much it. Now, in addition to 5 probes, I'm also assuming that the A-bar system has probes as well, that it involves probe goal dependencies and activation and valuation of features. I'm going to talk just generally of an op probe, quite simply, just a general A-bar probe as an op probe, just for the sake of the presentation, really. But this op probe, whether or not a head, whether or not a clausal phase head has an op probe, counts towards whether it's defective or not. So if you have a declarative C, say without any kind of op probe on it, then that's defective for the A-bar system, therefore it's defective, therefore it has to have the undeletable kind of edge feature. If you have a WH kind of C, which has the op probe on it, then that's not only phi complete, it's also op complete, if you like. So that counts as really, in the clausal system, the only truly non-defective head is C with an op probe on it. So that's the only one which has a deletable edge feature. So that's summarized in 24. So the heads that we're going to be using, the clausal heads, effectively declarative C and both kinds of little v, they're all defective in some way, whether it's for the phi system or the A-bar system or for both. So they have to have the undeletable kind of edge feature. But the interrogative C in 24a has the deletable kind because that's completely complete. Right. So, section 3 then, skipping ahead to DPs, which is really the most important kind of category when we're talking about subject islands, which is what I'm interested in. Are DPs phases or not? Well, that's a question that's been discussed a lot again, not with any great amount of consensus. There's questions about whether it's just definite DPs that are phases. If DPs are phases, are they strong or weak strong or weak phases in Chomsky's 2000-2001 sense? The idea that phases are the locus of uninterpretable features and gives us a handle on whether or not they are phases and in what sense they are phases. As I'm going to run through now, they are phases, but they have a particular transfer pattern because the feature that's relevant, the feature that they have that's unvalued and acquires a value is the case feature. But the case feature is always dependent on a higher head for its valuation, a clausal head like C or V. And so they're not going to actually be transferred until they've been valued by the higher head, which means that there's a kind of delay on transferring a DP. Now, if there's a delay on transferring that DP, then its internal domain remains, i.e. its complement, the bit that you would transfer, remains in the syntax for longer than it would otherwise, which means you can exploit this loophole under certain circumstances and get inside a DP and sub-extract stuff out of it in certain circumstances and not in others, but it affords a certain wiggle room. So let's just consider what kinds of phases we have amongst DPs. Now I'm going to assume, following a lot of work on the literature in things like agreement restrictions and person-case constraint, that we have a difference between DPs that have a person specification and DPs that don't have a person specification. And often that is divided such that person maps to such semantic notions as definiteness and specificity and animacy. So the idea then is that indefinite DPs lack person, whereas definite DPs have person. Now, the indefinite DPs by lacking person will count as defective, and so they'll have the undeletable kind of edge feature, whereas whereas definite DPs are non-defective, so they would have, potentially, they would have a deletable edge feature. They don't need the undeletable kind. So that's the idea with that. Okay, quarter of an hour. That's the main idea to take out of section 3, I think. Okay, so let's skip to some derivations, and I'll try and get through those fairly quickly so that I can then talk about repair by ellipsis, which is, of course, going to be a big concern, and already is been a big concern of this conference so far. So let's just, what facts am I interested in deriving, section 4? I'm actually, quite a lot of things I think have been ignored in the post-on phases literature when islands are discussed, but I take these facts to be central. First of all, although of course there's this asymmetry between specifiers and complements in terms of extractability, that contrast falls away. If we look, sorry, what I'm trying to say is that it's often overlooked that even definite objects are islands. So although there's this contrast between specifiers and complements, that only holds of indefinites. Definite objects, definites in complement positions, are just as much islands as they are in subject position, as shown in 27. This is an old observation going back at least to Fiengo and Higginbotham. So I take it to be pretty crucial there's a distinction between definite and indefinite DPs. Also, it's often said recently that if you leave a subject in its base position, then it's not an island, you can see into it. Usually on the basis of examples like 28A and 28B. So if you have an expletive and that allows you to leave a DP downstairs unmoved, then you can extract out of it. But as indeed Chomsky discusses a lot in derivation by phase, there are plenty of examples where you have an expletive and extraction and sub-extraction alike are still out, and those are in things like in 27C, D, and E. So I don't take it to be a given that if you leave a DP in situ inside a phase domain, then it's still accessible. What's really going on is that it will be accessible up to a point, but as soon as it's been valued, its case has been valued, then it will transfer its complement, it will no longer be accessible. So it's not really coherent to talk about certain positions as being frozen or not. Positions become frozen in the course of the derivation according to when valuation takes place. So I take that to be a central factor as well. Okay, so running quickly through some derivations, and all the detail is on the handout, and I'm sorry I'm leaving so much for you to read here. So skipping to section 3.1 at the bottom of 13, that should actually be section 4.1, but I'll renumber it some other time. What did you buy a book about? The derivation is given in 31. The key point is that once you've valued the DP, the key stage is 31D. Once you've valued the DP, once little v is valued case on the DP, and you transfer the complement of, and you transfer the complement of that D, anything active inside it can still raise to the edge, because this is an indefinite and it has an undeletable edge feature. And so that places the active WH material at the edge of the DP. And then when you in turn you value the phi features on the V, spell out V's complement. V's got an undeletable edge feature. You then shift that WH material higher up to the edge of the V phase, which puts it in a position where it can then be accessed in the CP phase, which we'll come to later on in 38. In the case of a definite object, then you're going to have a crash at that equivalent point, i.e. point D, because I'm assuming that a definite DP differs from a indefinite DP in having in being non-defective and therefore having a deletable edge feature. Therefore, it doesn't have an edge that can be used here. Because it doesn't have an edge, as soon as you value D and you transfer its complement, any active material inside is going to crash because it has no possibility of escaping. Or at least later on in the derivation, when you come to the probe that needs to get a value from that item, i.e. the WH probe on C, it's not going to be able to find it because it's been transferred and it's not accessible. Okay, skip 3.2. We'll move to subjects. So the DP, treating now the DP in spec V, and we're moving on to the C phase now. Now the interesting thing about C is it's a composite probe. It has two probes on it. It has both the op probe and the phi probe. And so the question is which of those two should probe first? And here I think again we can exploit the dynamics of the derivation. Let the derivation decide really. Rather than stipulating op probes first or phi probes first, they should both be launched together as a kind of composite probe. And whichever goal is met first, that determines which of the probes is valued first. So if the WH goal is met first, then the WH probe is valued first. If say the subject is met first, the DP, then it's going to be the phi probe that is matched and valued first. So the structure, the derivation decides which gets valued first. And this then gives us a difference between something like 36, what did the book about cause a scandal, and the equivalent stage of the derivation, 36. So 37 gives you the structure for 36, where you see that the book about what has been moved to the edge of the V phase due to. Sorry. This is a subject. This is equivalent. It doesn't matter whether it's a passive or whether it's a base-generated transitive subject in the edge of V here. It's still active. But the point is, the first item that the probe will see is the book, and therefore the phi feature will be valued. This causes you then to spell out the complement of that D phase. And if you've got a definite subject, at least, then it's going to crash because you can't get inside it. If you have something like in 38, then this is continuing the derivation that we started in 31. Then what is now in what is the closer goal, because that's been what Chomsky's calling directly feature-driven movement, IFM, I successively moved to the edge of the V phase. It's above you, so the first item to be met by the probe will be what, so it's actually the op probe that gets valued first, which means that the phi probe can then continue and value and be valued by the DP. So all the probes can be checked off and valued fine in 38 because what is above U, but because it's the other way around in 37, you basically get the island effect, at least with the definite DP. You have to say a bit more about indefinite subjects, which is on the handout. I will skip that. I'll also skip scrambling in German, but I'm basically saying that reduces to a definiteness island again. How many minutes now? 7. Okay. So let's quickly look at section 3.5, which is this idea that expletives sometimes make a difference, but sometimes they don't. So sometimes having an expletive in the derivation causes a kind of melting of the island, as we saw in 28a and 28b. In other cases, it doesn't. Can this system account for that discrepancy or asymmetry? I think it can, again, exploiting similar kind of differences in derivational timings and which goal is encountered first. Insofar as we can, insofar as there's a structural difference, as in 42 and 43, then the difference will follow, I believe, from the dynamics of probing. So my claim is that there are expletive structures which are like 42, and there are others which are like 43. The kind of those structures like 28a and 28b involve a structure like 44, which is 42, where the expletive starts out higher than the DP. And what this means is that the phi probe goes down the tree, it finds the expletive, it's busy doing the expletive. That means that the op probe can then continue down the tree and get to the associate, or the DP, before that DP has been deactivated. Now, the whole idea with this system is that value triggers transfer, transfer triggers opacity. So as long as something is still remaining unvalued, it's not an island yet. you can still see into it. So there's this loophole that as long as you can get to a DP before its case has been valued, it's not an island yet. And an expletive may be a way of doing this by kind of getting in the way of the phi probe, preoccupying it, whilst and then allowing the op probe to get to the DP first. Now, if it's plausible to say that there's also cases in which the structure is the other way around, as in 43, then in that case, the expletive is not going to make any difference because here the first goal to be encountered is the DP anyway. And I think there are cases where indeed you will have something more like 43, and those would be cases like 28, C, D, and E, where you don't get the melting effect. But there's probably not time to justify that difference here. The idea, though, is that if you just have a simple unaccusative, say, then I assume that the expletive merges in the specifier of that of little v, as I've argued elsewhere, and as lots of people have argued, for a low merge site for the expletive. And IFM, that is successive cyclic movement of the active D, at the end of that V phase, will move that DP to a position above the expletive before you ever get to the CP phase. And so it will be the case that by the time you get to C, where all these probes are, D will be the closer goal. So I do think there is evidence, or there are reasons for assuming that we can have these two different structures, and they do roughly, I think, correspond to the when we do get melting with expletives and when we don't. So there's this idea I just wanted to put out there that if we think of a DP, if we want to think of opacity purely in terms of the PIC, then it's only going to arise that opacity once you've actually once the phase head has been valued and therefore its complement has been transferred. Before that point, it's not an island yet. And if you can deflect the probe in some way and get to that DP before it's been valued, then you're not going to have an island effect. Okay. So finally then, in the remaining few minutes, I want to skip to section 4.3 and ask what, if anything, this system may have to say about repair by deletion. And again, as Howard was talking at the end of his talk just now, I'd like to also give some substance to the idea of PF islands as actually being a PF thing, but in a different kind of way from the Uri Gericke and Fox and Pazetsky approach. Really, the kind of view of PF islands that comes out of this approach is to flip repair by deletion on its head and say it's not repair by deletion, but more damage by transfer. So let's just give a couple of examples and then discuss them. So this is clearly a syntactic approach to islands, and yet I'm saying that there can still be a kind of PF effect here. Why should that be? Well, just sticking to the kind of examples that we've already been looking at, you can see in 50A that sluicing will rescue something like the subject island that we were deriving a moment ago, whereas a VP ellipsis won't rescue the kind of definite object island that we were looking at. So is there any reason why TP sluicing should rescue the island but VP ellipsis not? These are the kinds of questions that came up earlier, of course. So the idea here, turning to page 21, is that in the case of sluicing, the island is never created in the first place. Now, I say that's a fresh perspective. Of course, we've already heard that there are lots of people have said that in these cases there's no island to repair, but I'm not saying that there's no underlying island, that there is an island in the source, as it were. It's just that that island only comes about if you actually transfer the phase to PF. If you don't transfer the phase to PF, then you don't get the damage in the first place, because it's actually the mapping to PF which creates the opacity effect. So the way to think about this is under where I've written 2 rows to silence. There are 2 ways of getting silence at PF, I think, in this system, in this architecture. The first is that you do actually transfer the phase head complement to PF, and then you insert your material, and then PF processes take place, be it deletion of chain links, chain resolution, linearization, whatever. And this allows, a hallmark of this road to science is that individual lexical items, individual copies can be targeted for deletion. But there's also a more wholesale way of getting rid of stuff, except it's not getting rid of stuff, it's just not putting it there in the first place. And that is that you don't transfer a particular phasal domain at all. There's nothing to dissert, nothing to delete, nothing to recover. And a hallmark of this would be that it could only be entire phasal domains in that case, phase A complements, that would be able to become silent in that way. Now, this second road is the one that I'm going to assume is taking place in the case of TP sluicing. The first road is what's happening with VP ellipsis for reasons we won't have time for. But again, it does hark back to the idea that Howard was mentioning, that VP ellipsis with WH movement is something a bit different, and I would like to say that it's road 1 rather than road 2. Because you do actually transfer stuff to PF in that case, there's no amelioration of the island. So the idea then is that we have this option of not transferring to PF if we think of the architecture in the kind of asymmetric way that Berwick and Chomsky and lots of others have talked about recently, that really language is only perfectly designed for the mapping to the semantic interface. That's kind of like the same system, it's a continuation, whereas PF is an adjunct, it's where we find rather a botched job. You have to make do a lot of the time. The syntax is not perfectly designed for talking to the sensory motor interface. So externalization is secondary. So it may be assumed perhaps that interface conditions like full interpretation really only hold of the mapping to the semantics. Of course, if you have to interpret everything, if everything has to be interpreted, then everything has to be transferred. So that's true on the semantic side. But it may well therefore be the case, because PF is this kind of secondary afterthought, evolutionarily as well perhaps, that transfer to PF is only optional. So that's the assumption that I put in 51. Now there's another asymmetry as well, which is in 52, and this harks back to an idea which Chomsky's been talking about again recently, that he's been trying to clarify that really there are two views of transfer, and he's only really had the second view in mind. The first view is strong transfer, which is what most syntacticians I think actually work with. I do, certainly, as well. That when you transfer the complement of a phase head, that is gone. You can't do anything with that. Narita has a particularly strong view of this. So you transfer something, and the PIC puts a boundary there, and you can't see that material anymore. Chomsky says in recent talks, and indeed it is in his earlier papers, that when you transfer stuff, it's not actually gone. It's still there in the syntax. You just can't fiddle with it anymore, as it were. So that's a kind of weaker view of transfer. And I'm going to again assume that I'm going to assume a compromise that both is correct. That optimally designed transfer is indeed weak in Chomsky's sense, i.e., the mapping to the semantics is weak. But in the case of transfer to PF, that is the strong transfer, where you do actually remove stuff from the syntax. So it's only when you transfer to PF that you are removing stuff from the syntax and therefore expect island effects to occur, to arise. If you just transfer to the semantics, then that material is still there and thus potentially visible to higher probes. So you're not going to get island effects if you choose not to transfer to PF and you only transfer to semantics, then you only have weak transfer, and therefore you're going to have a material that's still accessible. So it follows, if you combine 51 and 52, that only if you choose the option of PF transfer, that is non-ellipsis, that you're going to get the damage. So it's damage by transfer. It's transferring to the PF interface that causes the island to arise in the first place. If you don't transfer to PF, that material never reaches PF, then you're not going to get the island effects. There's more detail on the handout, but suffice to say that sluicing, as has been argued by many, targets exactly the kind of thing which could well be road 2, i.e. it's the TP, that's the complement of the phase head C. Others too have suggested that ellipsis sites are always phase head complements. Well, the difference between what say Gallego and Gengel have proposed and what I'm proposing isn't that you do transfer these complements of the phase head and then delete them at PF. Rather, they just don't get to PF in the first place. It's kind of maybe a radical idea, maybe it doesn't work, but I think it's a possibility that arises under this architecture, and it would give us another way of thinking about repair by deletion. But because I'm over time, I will leave the rest of it for your reading pleasure. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a short question, maybe.
when you say, well, so you probe and then you meet this thing first and then you meet this other thing, it seemed to me sometimes that C command between terminals was relevant, and sometimes it seemed that containment, that labels were relevant, and I couldn't quickly enough.
Hopefully it's always C command.
And what would that follow from? Because it's not obvious at all how a probing mechanism actually gives you C command. So I'd like to hear what you think.
Well, I just take the view that a probe looks into its sister and searches down the tree, which is a kind of
But how does it search down the tree? There's many ways you can go down. You can go down the left branch. You can go down the right branch first. How do you know that? You can go line by line, and almost all of the options that I've just said, which are the obvious ones, none of them give you C command. They give you other things, but none of them give you C command.
Well, just traversing the tree downwards, I think, gives you the probe searches down its sister branch first, and it can only, first of all, there's a limit. It can only go as far as a PIC boundary anyway. Now, in the case of, did you have any particular one in mind that was?
Well, so you go down into the sister, and then there's two branches. And which one do you go down now?
Well, you could do it like a tree traverse algorithm that's been proposed for linearization. So you could search down the left branch first and then go down the right branch. But in all the cases I've talked about, it doesn't matter, I don't think.
Well, I think it does because for example, in the expletive case, where the expletive sits higher, you know, if you end up if there's optionality, then your story works because then you can go down into the expletive branch first and be preoccupied. But if you go down the wrong branch first, then you meet the associate.
So I guess I have to have a notion of closeness that does put in C command, which doesn't necessarily follow from probing in the way that you say. I agree. So I probably need to be a bit more careful there.
And I think the same is true for the extraction from DP cases.
Yeah, I was assuming just this additional notion of closest, but as you say, it's still something in addition to probing. So okay, that is a slight enrichment. Yeah, fair enough.
Cedric, yeah. No, if you don't mind, please use the microphone because otherwise we are videotaping the conference. So.
It's a short question, but it's about the edge feature. What's your understanding of what the edge feature is? Like, I probably have a naive view on this, but I thought that the edge feature was simply a trait of saying I'm a lexical item, meaning I can combine. And if that's the understanding of it that I thought I got from Chomsky, then does it make sense to say that this goes away? Like, you know, once John is a lexical item, it's always a lexical item.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways it doesn't make sense to say it's deleted because it's not something that's looking for a value. It's not something that gets valued. But I was just exploiting this original tentativity that Chomsky had himself, whether he should say that these things are deletable or not. And I thought I would just maybe suggest that they can be. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't entirely make sense to think of them as being deletable in any syntactic sense. Yeah.
Any other question? Okay, so thank you very much.